Welcome back to short series of videos on H.A. Prichard. And in the first video, if you haven't checked that one out, go have a look at it. I gave some background on Prichard and why it's worthwhile studying him. And some key ideas of his, and the one that the quick takeaway was the idea of conceptual analysis. He wants to become really fine-grained in this when he does his ethics. So now I'm turning to one of Prichard's works itself that was praised by numerous philosophers, the great W.D. Ross, who wrote this classic work, The Right and the Good, praises Prichard's work as being, shall we say, Ross's fundamental debt is to the thought of Prichard. Now, which Prichard are we talking about? So I'm taking out of a collection of essays of Prichard that in fact came out around 1949. But this is a 1912 article, Does Moral Philosophy Rest on a Mistake? And this little book contains this article, and of course it's no surprise, it's edited by W.D. Ross, who again offers a little note, a little preface praising Prichard's work for its clarity. And a number of other thinkers, as I mentioned in the previous video, were quite impressed by Prichard's emphasis on clarity. His writing is clean and crisp and quite clear. So what's he up to? Well, as I stressed earlier, he wants to get around this sort of an intuition or a pure kind of seeing. And I put it in scare quotes because it's not like regular visual seeing. However, be careful. It's not, as I've been stressing, don't think of it as anything really mystical. So I want to give you a way of thinking about it. And it's a lead-in to how he starts this essay. So think about an intuition or a seeing in the context of reading an ultrasound. Now, if you've ever seen an ultrasound, when I saw one, I had no idea what was going on in there, and the nurse said to me, well, do you want to know what's going on in there? And I said, well, I certainly can't tell. And he said, well, I can tell you exactly and pretty well anything you want to know. And so he could tell me a bunch of stuff about the baby. And of course, I couldn't see anything, right? I saw, in one sense of the term seeing, of course I saw the ultrasound, but I couldn't read it. I couldn't get the meaning out of it. I couldn't see it in a certain way such that I could, quote unquote, read it. Similar if you look at something like ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. Unless you happen to have studied that, they would be a series of objects, and that wouldn't really have much meaning to them. And certainly you wouldn't see the meaning that you would get as if you studied it. Same thing with an ultrasound. But in one sense, you do see all the stuff. So the nurse didn't have something different in front of him than I did. It's just what's important is he went to ultrasound reading school or nursing school or whatever they do, that you can train to do this. So had I decided to do something else as a career, I could have done that and then learned how to read this. So it's not that mystical, but if you don't have the right kind of sensitivity or background or whatever, you won't, quote unquote, see it. So I hope that demystifies this notion of a seeing or an intuition. Just think of this can become a little more fine-grained. This is how Prichard begins his paper. He says something like this. When you're sensitized by education, right? Think about it. You can get more sensitive to things via education. For instance, you could grow and develop an appreciation of art. If you're trained, you can understand art better. You may even become not only understanding it more in terms of its cultural context or its history or whatever, but you might even grow to like it more. So the more you can understand, the more you might be, it can change your experiences. So knowledge can change us. Training, education can change us deeply. And that's his point. Right away, he starts off, he says, look, when you become sensitized by education, right? So he's naturally referring to the education he got. But in any case, the principle is that education can sensitize you, and it can sensitize you to feel things that you might not normally feel. So you can become educated to feel things that you didn't feel before. You can train, in a sense, the feelings. Now, this idea of educating yourself to feel differently may strike us today as a little odd. Right? Because we tend to think feelings and all that stuff, they are what they are. Leave them alone. You can't do anything with them. The best you can do is maybe control them. But think about it. We do talk to children about feelings and training their feelings. Aristotle said we have to. The feelings, as a matter of fact, our feelings are like children. Plato thought the feelings were like, kind of like emotions and horses running around in your head. You better get them under control. But this idea of training the feelings and becoming more sensitive, well, we do talk about sensitivity training. And again, with little children, we do train them if they do something mean and they think it's funny. We do say, well, you shouldn't do that. That's not funny. You shouldn't get pleasure or enjoyment out of those kinds of things. You should get pleasure and enjoyment out of being nice. So you should feel an obligation. You should feel in a certain way. So we do, as a matter of fact, often try and educate people, sensitize them so that they feel in certain ways. That's all Prichard is really saying here. He's saying, so once you're sensitized by this education, you can come to feel the force of an obligation. So once you become in a certain kind of mental state of some kind or whatever, you can just see this, feel this force of an obligation, right? That becomes obvious to you. That becomes a part of your experience. Now, drawback is when you start becoming aware and feeling the force of obligations, like I ought to do something. Once you become sensitized and you start feeling this, well, it's not like you lose the other parts of yourself, namely all the desires. Before, when you're maybe a little child and you just want ice cream, and then eventually you're sensitized a little bit about, well, you ought not to really just want ice cream, or you ought to want to eat healthy things. There sets up a clash, right? Classic clash between the feeling of obligation or the force or whatever and desire. So this is a very classic kind of notion. This clash of obligations and desires. In other words, you can, in a more moral setting, or a little bit more philosophical way of putting it, you can duty what you ought to do versus your self-interest, what you want to do. So duty and desire. So there's a clash between these two. Now, Prichard says this is more or less natural, and he does have a lot of naturalism for kind of someone who's branded as kind of an intuitionist. There's a lot of naturalism in his thinking that this is quite typical. Right? There's nothing unusual here. There's nothing weird here. So if you see it along these lines, you just become trained, and your system, your brain, your system becomes trained up that you can feel this, and you can generate this clash. Now, this is an old one, right? There's certainly nothing new here. As I said, this is classic stuff, right? This clash between obligations, desires, duties, and interest. And many philosophers struggled. Like if you read Kant, for instance, a lot of his philosophy is all about trying to reconcile these things, that sort of your desires and duties, once you get them all properly lined up, they'll eventually converge and all will be well. So this clash, this split, this dichotomy, this rupture can eventually, once all things are taken in and thought through, can reunite into a kind of harmonious whole, which is one of the great ideas in ethics in the philosophical tradition, is ultimately a person has to be a whole and a unified one. But this notion that there is a clash comes up all the time. Whenever I teach ethics, someone always asks, why should I be moral? What's the point of this? Well, clearly, Plato recognized this because in the Republic, he asks a zillion questions in there, talks a lot about justice, but in Book 1, he does start off and talk about why be moral. Book 1 and Book 2 do talk about this, and Socrates is challenged on this. Why should I be moral? Like, what's interesting? What's in it for me? Why should I be interested in morality? And Socrates talks to people like Thrasymachus, and who's kind of this, I'd say, kind of a quasi-Nietzschean fella who's, might makes right. So really, notions of obligations and duty and all that, that's really just an expression of power, right? That's how it should be, and things like that. So that's a kind of reductionism, right? To take morality and talk about it in terms of power. So for Prichard, that's a fundamental mistake. As I mentioned in the previous video, he's anti-reductionist. So talking about obligations in terms of something other than obligations is a mistake. That's a reductionist move, and it's wrong. So this doing our duty, this clash that is set up in this way, you feel this obligation to do it, also generates this question. Well, is this really justified? Right? Did my training really set me up with a justified feeling? Did my training really set me up to read the ultrasound correctly? Is this am I right here? Is there, also you could say, is there a proof? Right? Are there proof? Can you prove things in ethics? Aristotle said, no, that's ridiculous. You can't do that. And if you think you can, then you're not really understanding what ethics is all about. Prichard's sympathetic to that. When you ask for a proof in ethics, you're really not understanding what's going on in ethics. Right? For Aristotle, he said, you're confusing ethics and mathematics, right? If you want a mathematical proof in ethics, you don't really see that ethics is a totally different enterprise than that of mathematics. And likewise, if you were to do mathematics and not demand a proof, you don't really understand how math works. Math runs on proofs. And to say, well, I don't need them, you need to go back and do a few math courses because you're clearly not getting what's going on. So this idea of feeling the obligation, generating these clashes, and then ultimately asking for a proof, this can easily give rise to moral skepticism, just like you can give rise to all kinds of skepticism, like a different kind of skepticism in terms of knowledge. You might say, am I reading these things correctly, etc., etc. So Prichard says that these are some of the preliminaries that we think about. We are susceptible to errors in knowledge. We can be susceptible to all kinds of errors, even in moral philosophy. So once again, we're opening up this kind of, shall we say, this doubt or this skepticism about obligations. Now, to address this, the tradition has, and remember, does moral philosophy rest on a mistake? So when he says moral philosophy here, he's really talking about the tradition. Does it rest on a mistake? Well, what has the tradition really said? Well, in answer to this question, why be moral, which Plato does address, he thinks that, you should be moral because in the long run, honesty is the best policy. We hear stuff like this. What does that really mean? Well, think about it. If you're a good person and you're honest and whatever, then you don't need quite as good of a memory as the liar needs, right? Because if you are really honest, then you're just talking about how the way the world is, and you don't have to worry about being tripped up in lies. So underneath this idea of honesty is the best policy, there is this, it will be in the end to your advantage. Well, that's one of the first ways that Prichard says the tradition answers this why be moral question. It will be to your advantage. It will even make you happy. Right? Aristotle is quite clear. If you look at happy people, they tend to be good people. If you look at people that are not very ethical, that are kind of problematic in that area, they tend not to be that happy. So makes sense, doesn't it? Why be moral? It'll make you happy. That seems a pretty good response, doesn't it? And Prichard's not saying it's a bad response. He's just saying it doesn't really address the question. So be clear. It's possible to pose a question and get a good response, but the response doesn't really address the question. That's Prichard's point. He's not saying that these are all ridiculous. He admits there's some truth to them, and there's some motivation here, but he's saying they don't really, that is 1 and 2, don't really address the why be moral question. Okay, so the second one is shall we say, is a little bit different, because the first one, this make you happy kind of thing, he relates it to consequentialism, and a species of that is utilitarianism. We'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And then the second one is, because this one here sounds a little bit subjectivist, right, or subjective, or however you want to put it, the second answer has been, well, engaging in moral actions brings about a good, either like the moral action itself, right? There's some kind of goodness that's embedded in a moral action, or you'll bring about some kind of good. It may not even be anything to do with you, right? It might be, like when people say, I saved the puppies from drowning or something because it was the right thing to do. I didn't do it for a reward or to be praised in the media of any kind or something like that. I just did it because it was the right thing to do. And everybody, including myself, we'd all go, hey, that's great. We're often quite happy to hear people talk like that. That tends to push the discussion that you're fulfilling the obligations because you generate something. It may not be a personal, subjective notion, but it's something, a goodness or whatever, or the moral action itself is intrinsically good. Well, so we've got the second general view of the tradition, a deontological one. So you've got a bit of a virtue ethics, consequentialism, utilitarianism wrapped up over here, and then associated with the likes of like Plato and Mill and maybe a little bit of Aristotle even. And then over here in the second one, you've got a deontological one, and of course, one of the main representatives, but certainly not the only one, of that deontological tradition would be someone like Kant. All right, so we got our question, why be moral? We got a couple of answers. And again, are there mistakes being made? And the answer is yes. So why does he think there are these mistakes? Well, Prichard starts with a number. He's going to criticize these for quite a few pages, and we'll look at some of his criticisms. But of course, you want to have it where he offers, well, if these are all wrong, what's the right answer to why should I be moral? Well, you'll have to wait. That'll come in a later video. For now, think of it this way. We're going to look at why these are wrong, according to Prichard. And I want you to think about whether Prichard is correct in his diagnoses of these two and why they're problematic. So we can debate with Prichard, but let's first try and understand where he's coming from here. So basically he offers a preliminary criticism of this one. So this idea of the make you happy one, he says that it is a reductionist move, right? Now remember, reductionism, right? You're taking a concept, you're taking an idea, and you're trying to explain it in terms of something else. Well, in this one, with regard to one, you get people like Plato, Butler, Hutcheson, Mill. They held this view. So Prichard says it's an important view. Big names have held it. So they're still wrong, though. Well, it's a very natural way. It's a natural kind of response, though. So it's not an unusual one. It's actually quite a typical one. But think about this, Prichard says. If you say to me, why should I be moral? And then I say to you, it'll make you happy. Think about what you asked me and think about what answer I actually returned. You asked, why should I? And I answered by saying, here's something that you would like. Right? You asked a should question, and my answer was a motivation, not really a should, why you should do it, but it was more of what Kant would call a kind of hypothetical. Well, if you should be moral, because if you want to be happy, and you want to be happy, don't you? Well, then you should be moral because it'll make you happy. You'll get something good out of the deal. Now, what does that do? that really doesn't address the should part of the why should I, like why be moral, like why should I be moral? What it does is it just says, I'm going to give you, instead of why you should, I'm just going to give you what's in it for you, right? I'm going to give you something like a motivation. Kind of like if you say to me, let's say I'm your piano teacher, and you say, why should I learn the piano? And I say, play those scales and I'll give you a chocolate ice cream cone. Well, now I'm tapping into your desires, right? Now I'm giving you, I'm motivating you, no question, right? I am motivating you because you're asking a why should I question, and I'm giving you a motivator, chocolate ice cream cone. You're asking why should I be moral, and I'm giving you a motivator. You'll be happy. This is Prichard's point. This is a kind of reductionism. This doesn't really answer the question, why should I be moral? Why should I play the piano? Like, how is asking for an ought or a reason for an obligation answered by getting an ice cream cone or being happy? Prichard says it's not. It's a dodge. And it might work. He's not saying that it's a bad thing. But sure, we can encourage morality by saying it'll be to your advantage. And that may be a psychological, shall we say, response. That may be a good way to get kids to start learning the piano. And what do? We hope to wean them, where they start seeing that they should play the piano not because they get ice cream. Right? That is a step in the right direction, but it's not a final answer to the why should I play the piano. So in this sense, it will be to your advantage. This is, shall we say, this is reductionist, right? Because it trades the question, why ought I? And then answers with, here's something you'd like, right? So it reduces the question of an ought. So the ought is reduced down or unpacked or described in terms of desires. Why ought you? It'll fulfill a desire. Well, wait a second, that's not the same thing. So this whole notion of this part of the tradition of explaining morality by trying to address this particular question and then doing the advantage thing or whatever, Prichard says this is ultimately a mistake. Not a gross one in terms of it doesn't provide a motivation. No, so we have to be clear as to what he means by a mistake. And what he means is that this does not answer this question. Why be moral? To say, you're going to be happy as a result of the deal. So this reduces obligation then to desires. So if I say, why ought to I keep my promises? Well, because keeping your promises maybe gives you a good reputation and you get what you want in the end, right? Again, it's a motivator. Yeah, okay, that seems pretty good. Yeah, why I would do that? Why I would do that? Because I'll get something. But that doesn't really answer the ought part, or the obligation. So he rejects this. Reductionism. He says that's not going to be specific and clear enough. That's not going to really address our question. And so he says, well, with that in mind, it seems natural to move over to the second one, the deontological view. And in this one, we base the obligation now kind of on a more abstract notion of goodness. This seems to be a bit better. It seems to be a little less psychological. The number one was just, as Prichard puts it, it's just so openly, subjective, right? It's just, you get something out of the deal. You fulfill a desire. This one seems to be a little bit less like that. And why do we like that? Well, again, this might be something that we're sensitized to, that morality should be something objective. It shouldn't be just a fulfillment of a desire. It should be something bigger than that, or further away from our desires, not just the fulfillment of them. That seems perhaps a little too crass. So in this case, it's a recognition that you're going to bring about some kind of good or goodness. But he's very insistent, though. If we're going to engage in moral actions to bring about something good, we recognize that the moral action will bring about something good. But we also have to realize that this recognition can't involve some kind of satisfaction of a desire. Yeah, I recognize it, and then if I do it, I'll get something out of the deal. Because if you turn it into that recognition ultimately leads to the fulfillment of a desire, well, now you're back in number one, reducing ought to the fulfillment of desires, and that's reductionism all over again. So this recognition has to be something quite pristine. Well, clearly we're talking Kant's language now, right? Reverence, there's nothing in it for me, there's nothing empirical. So Prichard is a little more sympathetic to this one, but nonetheless, after this preliminary look, he says, there really are problems. We pointed out the reductionists with this one. In the next video, I'll go into this a little more detail. But he thinks number two, also this Kantian framework runs into other problems that are just as bad. They're different, but they're just as bad. And when we look at how Prichard analyzes, especially I think this one here, we'll get a good idea of what he's going to say eventually is the correct answer to why be moral. And that answer that Prichard returns to this question is a very important one because it lays the foundations for the thinking that shows up here and then ultimately can be traced down the line through other thinkers, finally ending up with thinkers like John Rawls as well. So for now, we've got a preliminary question, why be moral? So yes, moral philosophy has rested on a mistake. Why? These two are the ways to answer traditionally, and they've been problematic. So next video, we'll dig more into the problems with number 1 and 2 as an answer to our fundamental question. Stay tuned.